At the beginning of the month, yet another Albertan managed to make national news when the CFO for an Alberta-based oil and gas company decided to go to Ottawa and tried to take a tour of the Senate. Now, the Senate's now closed for renovation, but when he was trying to take a tour of the Senate chamber, he was told by the security there that the I Love Canadian Oil and Gas Canada Action t-shirt that he was wearing was too political, and he wouldn't be allowed to wear it on the tour. He was asked to turn it inside out. He did go on the tour, but he then took a story to social media, and of course it blew up all over the place. Now, in fairness to him, the Senate Security Office did apologize to him and say that under those circumstances, he should have been allowed to take the tour with his shirt on. In true Albertan fashion, though, about a week and a half later, another Albertan went to Ottawa, this time trying to take a tour of Parliament. And he was wearing a Canada Action branded I Love Oil and Canadian Oil and Gas hoodie. Now, he was apparently told by security there that he wouldn't be able to go on the tour wearing it because, again, it was too political. Now, this also blew up all over social media, and there's no shortage of heavy hitters in the conservative world who decided to try to make a little bit of political hay and virtue signal just how much they support oil and gas. And one of the most interesting videos actually came from UCP House Leader Jason Nixon.
Let's be clear. Support for the Canadian energy industry is not a partisan message, and it is not offensive. It is a common sense position shared by millions of Canadians coast to coast.
Now, while it's great that Jason Nixon is doing his best to voice his support for the oil and gas industry, there's a couple of little details and there's some nuance to this whole situation that we need to talk about if we really want to understand what's actually going on and get to the point that that video is actually just a little bit misleading. So, first of all, there's some very strict rules in our parliamentary system of government in regards to a bunch of different things. When you can talk, where you can talk, what you can wear. There's dress codes that even MPs and MLAs have to follow when they're in their respective legislative bodies. One of the rules that exists for when anything is in session is that you can't wear any kind of political logo or any kind of logo that's affiliated with a political organization at all. That's one of the reasons why, if you take a look at tapes of the legislature when the Premier and the MPs and the MLAs and their various governing bodies are speaking, you will never see a Liberal Party logo, you will never see a UCP Party logo, and you will never see an NDP logo. It's because those are places where no logos are allowed. Now, at its core, the message of supporting Canadian oil and gas is a message that the vast majority of Albertans can completely get behind. It's one of the core industries in our province, and it has been for decades. In fact, there are so many people who support that message that some people even went so far as to call it,
it is a moral imperative.
Now, it's worth noting that the term moral imperative really only just refers to when somebody's conscience is telling them the right thing to do. Different people's consciences are going to tell them different things. But if we're going to talk about moral imperatives, it might be worth, especially in the context of the House Leader of the UCP government, it might be worth exploring other things that may be moral imperatives, like providing health care, like fully funding education and making sure that kids have schools to go to so they don't have to hang out in classroom hallways instead of the actual classrooms. And heaven forbid, for the Minister of Parks and Environment, it might just be a moral imperative to take a little bit of a look at global warming. But back to the actual shirt and the message on it. So it's really important to note that while the idea of supporting I Love Canadian Oil and Gas or I Love Canadian Pipelines or the various different variations that are produced of that shirt aren't inherently political, the organization that makes those shirts definitely is. If you don't live in Alberta and live and breathe the I Love Canadian Oil and Gas logos every single day on billboards, on bumper stickers, you name it, that logo somewhere, you might not know where that logo comes from. That logo is actually the brand of an organization called Canada Action. Now, we're going to do a deep dive on Canada Action on our next episode of The Breakdown because I don't want to get too caught in the weeds on this particular issue, but it's important to realize that the nonprofit entity that is Canada Action is an extremely political organization, and we've got some examples of how. Whether we're talking about Canada Action calling for boycotts of companies that they don't believe support oil and gas, whether we're talking about them propping up their favorite political candidates on their social media pages, and you better believe that there's a pattern to that, or whether we're talking about them sponsoring signage for rallies or signage for convoys traveling across the province or across the country, or even if they're calling for the premier of the province at the time to fire somebody who had been appointed to office because they didn't believe that they were pro-oil and gas enough, there's no way that we get around the fact that Canada Action absolutely is a political entity. And that's okay. They're allowed to be. We live in a country where we have freedom of expression, and they absolutely should be allowed to pursue those agendas. So it's perfectly legitimate for Canada Action to take these stances, to run these causes, to have their petitions, but you don't get to do all of those things and call for changes in government structure and at the same time claim that you're just a little old nonprofit that's totally non-political and doesn't have anything to do with that. Saying something like that is a little bit like the manufacturers of these toys trying to say that Special Man isn't at all derivative of what the original thing is. It's transparent, and if you take a long enough look at it, you can see right through it. Now, just to put a little bow on the end of this whole segment, there was a section of Jason Nixon's video that he released that we bumped on a little bit. And that's where he was talking about how he would make sure that if you wore your Canada Action I Love Canadian Oil and Gas t-shirt to the legislature, you would be able to take a tour. Here it is.
And you can be assured that if you come for a tour of the Alberta legislature, these messages of support are not only allowed, they are encouraged.
And as much as it shouldn't come as a surprise that somebody who's as enthusiastic about politics as Jason Nixon is would use this issue to try to create some division, not only in our province, but in our country, if you listen really carefully to the video, you notice that he says you can wear your shirt on a tour, but he doesn't say anything about when the legislature's actually in session, which we found interesting, and we wanted to clarify that because it seemed like a very deliberate choice of words. So what we did is we actually called the Office of the Sergeant of Arms at the legislature here in Alberta, and we asked if somebody wore a Canadian oil and gas t-shirt to a session of the legislature starts back up on October 8th, would they be allowed to stay in the gallery? Unsurprisingly, the answer was no. So to be clear, the Office of the Sergeant at Arms confirmed that no political slogans or branding are allowed in the gallery while the legislature's in session. So even in Alberta, in Jason Kenney's UCP Alberta, if you go to the legislature while it's in session and you try to sit in the gallery with your I Love Canadian Oil and Gas t-shirt, you won't be allowed in. So in the end, one might almost think that instead of trying to take advantage of the average Albertan's lack of knowledge of parliamentary procedure, which is obscure and most people wouldn't know it anyways, rather than try to stir up this divisive rhetoric and try to make political hay out of it, the UCP government could have sent Speaker of the House Nathan Cooper out to do one of his educational videos about obscure parliamentary stuff and tried to raise the bar instead of having Jason Nixon lower it again.